So I am Professor Dinkler. Welcome to the second of our Shaffer Lectures. I have the privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Eric Barreto. If you were here last night, you already know that Professor Barreto is the Frederick and Margaret L. Weyerhaeuser Associate Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. And if you were here last night, you also know that he attended Oklahoma Baptist University. He got his M.Div from Princeton and a Ph.D. in New Testament from Emory University. Professor Nasrallah also mentioned in her introduction last night that Professor Barreto is a leader in the Hispanic Theological Initiative, which mentors and collaborates with Latinx scholars from across seminaries and theological schools around the country. I first encountered Professor Barreto through his book, Ethnic Negotiations, The Function of Race and Ethnicity in Acts 16. And I'm hoping that you will indulge me a little bit of a personal anecdote because I loved that book, but I really came to understand Professor Barreto's work and way of being as a scholar when we met at a Wabash Center pre-tenure faculty workshop. And he is the first and only person who ever got me to download TikTok on my phone for pedagogical purposes, which I then never looked at ever again. But I also will say more seriously, he introduced me to an image that I use in my classes. If you've taken a class with me, you may remember this. This image of the artist's classroom where there is a subject in the middle, and artists sit around and they all paint from their own perspective. And the question then is, what are we looking at? What's in the middle? Is it the text? Is it interpretations of the text? Is it our own way of being? And that, I think, really is a wonderful metaphor, not only for how we can read scripture, but also for how Professor Barreto is as a scholar and academic, really honoring everyone's perspectives that they bring to this text. So please join me in welcoming again to the podium Eric Barreto for his second Shaffer Lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Dinkler. One of the joys of this work is wonderful friends you get to know over the years. So I want to tell you a story. Actually, I want to tell you several stories, some of which are found in the Gospel of Luke. But the first story is a story about an island whose air I first breathed and whose oceans were the delight of my childhood. Telling the many and complex stories of Puerto Rico would take much more time than we had this evening, or even over 3 lectures. You can read all about it, of course, or just ask any Puerto Rican. Hours later, we will just be getting started. As we begin, though, I just want to point to a couple of historical moments. In 1898, Puerto Rico's colonial masters shifted from Spain to the United States as a result of the Spanish-American War. One of the first acts of colonial power exercised by the United States was an attempt to change the island's name from Puerto Rico to Puerto Rico. Why? Because it was deemed that Anglophone tongues would not be able to articulate the vowels U and E together, and therefore they changed it to P-O-R-T-O instead of P-U-E-R-T-O. A colonial imagination says your name, your identity must bend to my linguistic abilities. A colonial imagination says, no, you have an accent. In 1899, William S. Bryan edited a volume of drawings and photographs under the title, Our Islands and Their People. The book was a tour of the newly acquired lands of the United States, promising to introduce the people and places the United States now possessed, specifically Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. One pair of photographs from this book lingers with me. On a single page, these 2 images stand together. On the left is a formal portrait labeled as a pretty Spanish girl. On the right is a there's that spelling there, I don't know if you can see it, Puerto Rican cigarette girl. There's a certain kind of colonial imagination that cleaves beauty, courage, value in a simple binary. Fast forward to 2016, when a fire knocked out power to 1.5 million people for 3 days. Again, a pair of images. On the right is a satellite image of the island at night on any particular evening. On the left is the island during the blackout. Neighbors struggling to provide light for children doing homework, to keep hospitals functioning, to simply live. A colonial imagination says they caused this without fathoming how we are actually contributors to the sources of civic, economic, and political disruption. A colonial imagination sees symptoms, but refuses to see causes. And of course, in September 2017, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico. There are so many stories I could tell about those days, including my own family's stories. You might have seen a picture of folks on highways holding cell phones aloft, hoping to catch a signal to send a text message. That is how my aunt finally was able to reach out after a number of days, letting us know that she and my ailing grandmother were safe-ish. Another vivid story is about the single suicide crisis line on the island, as covered by the New York Times podcast, The Daily, on January 3rd, 2018. There we hear stories about an overwhelmed system trying to care for traumatized people, brought back to horrifying fears whenever rain falls and the winds pick up, even months after the storm had passed. In the wake of Maria, I worried and still worry a great deal when we hear colonial logics emerge, especially when there was and continues to be talk about a new and better Puerto Rico. In the years since Maria, Ley 22, or Act 22, has exacerbated Puerto Rico's struggles to recover. The law provides tax advantages for people who move to Puerto Rico. If they bring their wealth, their crypto business, their real estate businesses, these individuals do not pay income tax. Homes and shuttered schools and apartment complexes and beach access have been bought at bargain basement prices in the wake of the destruction of the hurricane, pricing out locals while advantaging Airbnb owners and purported investors. Yorel Melendez Badillo's Puerto Rico, A National History summarizes the story of Puerto Rico in this way. What follows is a history of struggle. It is a history of resistance. It is the history of a non-sovereign nation along with its contradictions, hopes, and potential futures. It is an attempt to document the agency that has been rendered invisible in US media representations and disaster narratives through willful ignorance. It is intimate and it is painful, but it is also a beautiful and ongoing future-oriented history that is being written, rewritten, and imagined every single day. Or as Eileen Findley's Imposing Decency, The Politics of Sexuality and Race in Puerto Rico, 1870 to 1920, opens by writing, "The mottled past still haunts Puerto Rico." To think with Puerto Rico is always and already a grappling with this mottled past, whether articulated or not. In that way, thinking with Puerto Rico overlaps with biblical studies in significant ways, as these inquiries are always moving between a complex past and a challenging present, between an imperial past and a present still inflected by colonial assumptions. The rich, complex, modeled context of Puerto Rico will serve as exegetical and theological ground for our reading of the Gospel of Luke this evening. I will do so in conversation with Latinx theology, that is, the efforts of Latinx scholars to articulate theology within and in conversation with the complexity and diversity of Latinx identity. And in the end, I hope to persuade that contemporary contextual realities provide a rich vein of possibilities for exegetical work by clarifying dynamics of the past, as well as the limited purviews every interpreter brings to the exegetical task. That is, reading Luke from Puerto Rico is not the only way to read the text. Like all contextual footing, there will be richness and there will be gaps. Instead, contextual reading is always and inevitably a communal effort to contribute a clarifying voice of interpretation alongside many others whose stories deserve our hearing. Even more, we interpret among many others whose stories we desperately need. And so to scene 1, La Brega, John's call to soldiers and tax collectors. In Luke 3, we encounter John the Baptist's piercing voice in the wilderness. His voice draws out the crowds. They are looking for the salvation of God, hoping to spot it in the preaching and the baptism of this wild-eyed prophet, almost having stepped off the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures. If the crowds imagined they would hear some consolation, they faced disappointment from the first. "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Verse 7. "Even now the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." Verse 9. What then should we do? The crowd wonders. "You have warned us, John, about the wrath that is to come, the judgment that is bearing down upon us, the way a world of injustice requires God's mighty intervention. What should we do? What does God want us to do?" And John's answer is deceptively simple. Share what you have, whether a coat or food. And I say deceptive because that call to share what we have still eludes us all too often. After all, we have built a world where fewer and fewer have more and more people have much, much less. John's answer communicates that there is enough for all. For so many, our problem is not what stuff we lack. The challenge is our fear that we might not have enough if we share it with our neighbors. The undifferentiated crowds are not the only ones to ask what they should do. Specific kinds of folks ask for John's guidance. The tax collectors, in the same way they will feel drawn to Jesus in the gospel, see in John a possibility for their own redemption and transformation. What should we do, they ask. Here I am very tempted to speak for John. I am tempted with the confidence to guess what this wild-eyed apocalyptic preacher in the wilderness will say to them. Leave your tax booths. Stop serving the cruel empire. Repent and wander the wilderness with me. Soldiers too come to John. These soldiers represent the blunt force of the Roman Empire, the swords that assure the so-called Roman peace, if by peace we mean the kind of tranquility gained under the threat of violence. What should we do, they ask. Again, the temptation is there to answer on John's behalf. Lay down your weapons. Stop serving an emperor who is crushing us and the world. Don't bow at the feet of one who claims to be a deity among mortals. Leave your armor and follow me into the wilderness. But of course, John surprises me. This wild-eyed proclaimer of God's exacting judgment does not tell tax collectors and soldiers to stop being tax collectors and soldiers. He tells them to do something much more interesting, and I think much more revealing of the shape of grace in a world bent around empire and injustice and cruelty. John tells the tax collectors to collect only what is required of them, to evade the caricature we see of tax collectors in the Gospels as greedy and abusive of their power. Similarly, he tells the soldiers not to use their power for their own gain, but to be satisfied with their wages. So what happened to John here? Did he cower before these representatives of Roman power, sell out when faced with folks who might exercise power over him, fold when the going gets tough? In Justo Gonzalez's Mañana, Christian Theology from a Hispanic Perspective, a formative text for Latinx theology, he introduces the formative notion of Latinx communities taking part in what he calls a non-innocent history. That is, the realities of Latin American history mean that there is no innocence to be found among Latinx communities, for the way he says it is, the blood of the conqueror and the conquered alike course through our veins. Complicity in the power of empire is an inescapable component of the stories of Latinx communities. Complicity in the destructive forces of racism and misogyny, and we can add homophobia and transphobia, are unavoidable in a full telling of the story of Latinx people. Thus, despite claims made in the past, neither Puerto Rico nor Brazil or other places in Latin America are racial paradises wherein racism has been defeated. It is also true, of course, that Latinx communities have borne the brunt of colonial rule, felt the sting of extractive economies, the demands of migration. And so relatedly, in Puerto Rican culture, we make frequent use of the verb bregar and the noun la brega. Melendez Badillo, cited earlier, tells of a Puerto Rican power broker in the early 18th century as an illustration of the notion of bregar. He writes, at a moment when Spain was going through the War of Succession, Miguel Enriquez rose to power in Puerto Rico by protecting the crown's interests and successfully opposing European threats to the Spanish Caribbean. By doing so, he became the wealthiest and most powerful person in Puerto Rico. Unlike the rest of San Juan's elite at the time, Enriquez was a Pardo, the son of a formerly enslaved black woman and a white father who never recognized him. These two social traits were markers of social inferiority in Spanish colonial society. Enriquez's story highlights the many ways that individuals had to devise strategies to navigate social hierarchies. Enriquez's actions challenged colonial regulations, but did so without resulting in open confrontation. Literary scholar Arcadio Diaz-Quiñones has called the maneuvers Puerto Rican's art of bregar. For Diaz-Quiñones, bregar, which does not neatly fit its English translation of struggle, is a strategic practice of working around colonial violence without necessarily publicly opposing or conceding to it. Bregar is just really difficult to translate, but it is somewhere between struggle and defiance and survival and dealing. Bregar is a way to manage both everyday challenges as well as the overarching realities of life. Bregar is struggle, survival, persistence. Bregar is strategic, but also costly to its practitioners. Bregar is an act of truth-telling about the structure of the world as we know it. It's an act of hope that the world can be otherwise. And I wonder, too, if bregar, la brega, provides a clue for John's potentially puzzling call. I worry that sometimes we think that a commitment to justice calls us toward a purity none of us can actually achieve. A detachment from the world and its structures, too often only available to those who already have all that they need. I worry that we feel stuck when confronted with our complicity in webs of injustice all around us. So the weight of climate change, of racial injustice, of broken financial systems can make us feel powerless and shame-filled at the very same time, feelings which together conspire against hope. I think here John offers an apocalyptic possibility, not one that ends the world, but one that helps us see the world for what it actually is. The call here then is to an embodied transformation, one that sees the ways that the world has been warped by greed and injustice, and does not stop at hopelessness that any one individual action might make change. No, John invites us to imagine how ordinary acts, infused by God's extraordinary call to good news, might just change us all. John invites us to imagine how in living faithfully within faithless systems, we might point most effectively to the frailty of a way of life that relishes scarcity, that thinks only of the moment, that does not account for the high costs of our fears. John invites us to faithful life, one which infiltrates the vocation of even the tax collector or the Roman soldier, and thus might just infiltrate the life of any of us too. Moreover, I think John here seems to understand the very real limitations the colonized face. The limited options soldiers and tax collectors then, along with many others today, encounter. Despite this concession, however, John's call is still profound. It is a call to embody life within systems where death seems to prevail. So scene 2, sobremesa, food, memory, and home. The word sobremesa literally means over the table, and it's a word, it's that conversation that you have after you've eaten at dinner together with friends, and you haven't started putting away the dishes yet. You know that feeling, that conversation? You can say all that with one Spanish word. That's sobremesa. Food and eating is at the heart of Luke's storytelling. Early in the narrative, Jesus is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, apparently an insult, but it draws me to this portrait of Jesus, who spends so much time at tables and parties and feasts. The tables where Jesus eats in Luke are not just settings for instruction, but characteristic embodiments of the good news. The sharing of food is a taste of salvation, an invitation to experience the gospel in daily acts of eating, feasting, celebration. In short, Luke taps into a vital cultural reality for many, if not most of us, that food is both nutrition and identity. Food is sustenance, and it bears culture. Food is life, and it is living. Such everyday activity is also at the heart of Latinx theology. In my mind, the very drive wheel of many Latinx theologies was nurtured by Latina and mujerista theologians like Ada Maria Diaz. She contends that robust theological insight can be found in the everyday lives of those most marginalized by the structures of the world. Diaz turns especially to Latina women laboring in often invisible, though indispensable ways, tending hotel rooms and offices, caring for the children of the wealthy, cooking and cleaning in the kitchens of fine restaurants. The term she uses is lo cotidiano, Spanish for the quotidian. Lo cotidiano suggests that there is significant theological value in turning away from centering academia and pulpits in our search for theological insight, and instead focus attention on the faithful lives and transformative perspectives of those laboring on the underside of history. And there may be no activity more quotidian, more cotidiano, than food. As the chef Michael Twitty has concluded, everybody, you, me, every mama, every grandmama, every boy who loves to cook, every girl who likes to cook, brings their identity with them into the kitchen. You don't leave your baggage at the door, you bring it in with you. People can taste it in your food, he says. People know your story by the way your food tastes. So to know Puerto Rican culture is to taste the food of its people. Yet the food systems that nourish Puerto Ricans exhibit the complexity and challenge characteristic of the larger story of Puerto Rico. A 2017 report from NPR outlined the current status of agriculture and food in Puerto Rico in this way. The story starts, "It's astonishing, in fact, just how far farming in Puerto Rico has fallen over the past half century. According to USDA statistics, total sales from Puerto Rico's farms have declined by 2/3 in constant dollars since 1964. Prime agricultural land, much of it previously used to grow sugarcane, sits idle. Despite its tropical climate, which allows farmers to grow food year-round, Puerto Rico imports 80% of its food." And just as a side note there, the Jones Act requires that any product that's shipped to Puerto Rico must come on a US flagged ship, which means that all these other ships with other flags of countries have to go to Jacksonville or to Miami, unload all their stuff, reload it on a new ship, and then bring it to Puerto Rico. Back to the story. During a recent trip to Puerto Rico, the journalist, I heard many different reasons for Puerto Rico's dependence on imported food. Javier Rivera Aquino, a former Secretary of Agriculture for Puerto Rico, traced it back to the island's long history as a Spanish colony, when native farming traditions gave way to large plantations of sugar and coffee that were shipped back to Europe. Food, meanwhile, was imported. He says they were taught to produce what they don't consume, and they were taught not to produce what they consume, he says. That's the kind of dependence that was created under that colonial system. In 1964, sugar accounted for almost half of agricultural sales on the island, and sugar manufacturing accounted for 23% of all wages that Puerto Ricans earned. Then, within just a few years, the industry collapsed. Still in the story, according to an analysis by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Puerto Rico's sugarcane industry was hampered by government policies that prevented sugar producers from getting bigger and more efficient. It couldn't compete with sugar producers in places like Louisiana. Puerto Rico's government now owns the land where sugar once grew. The land is available for investors to lease, yet much of it sits still idle. Fernandez sees both economic and cultural reasons for this lack of investment. Economically, Puerto Rican producers had difficulty competing with large-scale food producers in the rest of the United States. Egg producers in Puerto Rico, for instance, were wiped out by cheap imports from the mainland. There's a kind of colonial imagination that takes ownership over someone else's food, only to sell it back at twice the price and half the taste and nutrition. It's a kind of colonial imagination that demands dependency. A colonial imagination teaches us that we cannot be free of these systems of hopelessness. In Luke 14, Jesus sits again at a table. This time he gives instructions for gathering at a feast that stand in tension with ancient and contemporary mores alike. So Jesus here, when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. In short, don't invite those who can pay you back. Host those who have nothing to give you. This is that next slide, talking about not hosting those. Invite those who can't pay you back is the basic idea here. And then what we read next is a parable of a dinner that is great, perhaps in its scale, in its audacity, and its public failure to draw guests, but not great because it reflects Jesus' own instructions or a picture of the reign of God. A landowner invites a litany of guests, each sharing what sound to me like exceedingly lackluster excuses. Each excuse also a reflection of social status. After all, the party host is rejected by the presumably high-status folks with whom he seeks to associate and invites those who can pay him back, whether via future invitations or social capital. Only after being rejected by those first invited, and in anger, does the master turn to the margins of his community for potential guests. He chooses the obverse of Jesus' advice, exercises his frustration by exercising power over his enslaved person and those marginalized because of disability. The excess of the planned feast is evident. When the second round of additional invitees cannot fill the home, so the first batch of people that the enslaved person goes and gathers they can't eat all the food. And so others are compelled to fill the home. and the ego of the jilted host. I wonder if I've missed some of these details, maybe some of us have too, and see in this text a picture of an inclusive table rather than its photo negative for several reasons. First, there is a tendency among preachers and interpreters alike, myself included, to associate God with the most powerful, the wealthiest person in the parable. Such a tendency strikes me as a form of colonial imagination in which power, wealth, possession are markers of greatness, which too many of us reflexively associate with the divine. Therefore, second, there is a tendency among us to make heroes of villains in the parables, to miss those attributes and actions that Jesus is lifting up in contradiction of those values that have most saturated our imaginations, especially the ways we value certain kinds of power, privilege, and possession. Third, there is a possibility here to form readers of parables who turn their attention, who look to God among not just the powerful, but among the marginalized, even perhaps among the non-human actors in the stories Jesus tells. So what is this parable doing then? What if this parable is not a simple allegory, but an alarming picture of the fragility of the powerful among us? Because God is not like this master. But if even this master can be compelled to look high and low for guests, then God, the God of abundance and grace and love, the God of lost coins and lost sheep and lost siblings, that God will stop at nothing to draw us to a table set for all people. When we lift up the jilted master, we make a hero of a villain. Moreover, what if God is not in the parable so much as God is hovering above this parable? Because again, God is not the party host inviting people. After all, the God of Jesus in Luke does not only invite the wealthy and the powerful who can repay God's generosity. Luke's God invites the Pharisee and the sinner, the powerful and the tax collector, the widowed and the wealthy. Moreover, what kind of God has people refuse a divine invitation to an extravagant feast? God, my friends, is nothing like this forlorn party host. This man so desperate to make sure his party is not wasted that he will invite the poor and the disabled, if only to fill his home and perhaps even that empty spot in his soul. As I thought about this lecture and wrote it, I thought about our home, the one my wife, my two children, and I have co-created. And I've thought about the meals that we eat. And I think I understood something finally that my body and my heart had already felt. My spouse, Holly, is an extraordinary cook and baker. And my family of origin introduced her to the joys of Puerto Rican cooking. It might be dangerous to say what I'm thinking about right before dinner about plátanos, mofongo, arroz con gandules, pan sobao. And she, being the extraordinary cook she is, learned how to make these dishes because, yes, she loves the food because it's awesome, but also because she loves me and the land that made me, the food that nourished me. When she cooks in this way, she is a guest in someone else's story. Why? Because she loves me along with our half-white, half-Puerto Rican children and the land that helped make us a family. And the love goes both ways. Holly's family includes a strong Italian heritage with the best of its traditions, including the tradition of Sunday gravy, or as it was known in Holly's family, sauce. That one word carries so much. My friends, I love sauce. I love gravy. And when I eat at that table, I am a loving guest in someone else's story. And the world all of a sudden gets a little bit bigger. Back to the same NPR report from earlier. Journalist writes, most of the news from Puerto Rico lately has been terrible. That's an evergreen statement. The island's government just declared that it cannot repay its bondholders and will carry out drastic cuts in education and social services. On Wednesday, thousands of students at the University of Puerto Rico voted to continue a protest strike. Food, though, is delivering a modest ray of hope. That hope will be on display most prominently this weekend at a conference called AgroHack, which celebrates the island's growing band of young food entrepreneurs, from chefs to coffee farmers. Last year, AgroHack drew 650 people. This year, organizers expect 1,500. Across Puerto Rico, in fact, the journalist continues, there's a new wave of interest in food and farming. People are thronging to new farmers markets. Chefs are making a point of finding local sources of food. The situation is now rapidly changing. Many consumers now are willing to pay extra for food grown on the island. University students are flocking to classes on agriculture. And Fernandez says the economic crisis is forcing people to try new things. He says there's a resurgence now because we have to reinvent ourselves. So I wonder, what if the reinvention is not just a reinvention of markets, but a reinvention of identity, a rediscovery of whom God has made us to be? And what if the gospel might inspire us to note that we are bound together in our differences, that the foodways and cultures of a people are not just a curiosity or a source for new exotic foods or a way to signal our openness to other cultures, but that the tables other people set are the very places where we encounter our complicity in broken systems, that uneven distribution of resources that fill some and leave others empty, but also that these same tables can be where we encounter God and our beloved neighbors in an unexpected and transformative way. And so scene 3, last, home and ambivalence. In 1983, Virgilio Elizondo published Galilean Journey, the Mexican-American Promise, marking a key starting point for Latinx biblical and theological scholarship. For Elizondo, that the Gospels identify Galilee as Jesus' home is not an incidental historical detail, but a formative reality for Jesus and for readers of the Gospels alike. Ancient Galilee, according to Elizondo, is a borderland, an interstitial space contested by empires, an in-between space of cultural fecundity, but also political challenge. Moreover, the notion of mestizaje, the blending of indigenous and Spanish peoples and cultures, is a critical outcome of these borderland realities, granting Latinx people the ability to see within empire in distinct and prophetic ways. And now, while I and others have critiqued Elizondo's work on various fronts, the complexity of the metaphor of the borderlands, especially the kind of ambivalence such experiences can nurture, is vital. Such ambivalence is a regular theme of Benito Antonio Martinez Ocasio, or as you might know him, the Puerto Rican reggaeton artist Bad Bunny. I'm really hoping this is the first time that somebody has cited Bad Bunny in this lecture series. His recent album, Debí Tirar Más Fotos, so I should have taken more pictures, bears a cover on the right, immediately recognizable by Puerto Ricans. 2 plastic chairs before a resplendent green background of tropical plants. The scene has my mind remembering my grandparents, sitting in the fresh air, enjoying music and conversation. That the seats are empty points to the absence of generations, both those who have gone before us, but also the many Puerto Ricans who have left the island for the past few decades. Indeed, it's been true for a long time and true today that more Puerto Ricans live outside of Puerto Rico than on the island. And I was telling some friends about this picture, and I said, when I saw this picture, I was like, that's the most Puerto Rican picture I've ever seen, and I can't explain it. And my wife was sitting there, and she's like, oh yeah, she's like, I know this picture, and so she found the picture on the left. It's not quite the same, but it's my grandfather, my father, my uncle, sitting in a similar pot. She went through all these old pictures. This is not digital picture. She's like, I'm gonna find this picture. Bad Bunny has described this album as his most Puerto Rican of his career. The guest artists are all Puerto Ricans. The musical styles range across the various forms of Puerto Rican music. The album is a celebration of Puerto Rico, but also a lament over the island's history of colonial domination, a lament over those who have felt forced to live elsewhere, That is, the album is an ode to a place and a people, while also a mournful lament. That mixture of celebration and lament echoes to me Jesus' own relationship to a place he and his family call home. It echoes Jesus' relationship with Jerusalem, a place that is dearly beloved by Jesus, revered by him in the narrative. And yet the cracks of imperial influence and power, I think, weigh down those feelings. Think of Mary and Joseph bringing Jesus as a mere baby to the temple, encountering Simeon and Anna and their prophetic declarations, including Simeon telling Mary that a sword will pierce your own soul too. Think of the adolescent Jesus feeling so at home in the temple that he is stunned that his parents were worried. As a parent of teenagers, that story is a horror story. Think of Jesus' extended lament over Jerusalem in Luke 21. From his prophetic noting of the widows giving all that they have while the rich give out of their abundance, to the grieved picture of Jerusalem's destruction, a destruction Luke's audience would have known viscerally. Think of the way Luke continues to narrate the presence of the disciples in the temple at the end of the gospel, but also as Acts begins. Jerusalem is a beloved place, now lamented as it smolders. Jerusalem is a home now inaccessible. Jerusalem is a dream hoped for rather than a tangible reality. That is, Luke's Jesus sees this city in the middle of love and ambivalence, hope and despair. Jesus' lament over Jerusalem in chapter 21 is perhaps best understood with our feet on colonized land. In January 2022, King Felipe VI of Spain visited the island of Puerto Rico. Among his public utterances was a statement praising Spanish colonialism in Puerto Rico for the Spanish values shared between Spain and Puerto Rico, and suggesting that the colonization of Puerto Rico was a model of Spanish rule. Spanish colonization, he argued, stood apart from other imperial powers in the Americas, for Spain's colonies were granted equal footing in the Spanish Empire. He remembered how, quote, Spain brought with it its language, its culture, its creed, and with all this it brought values and principles such as the foundations of international law and the concept of universal human rights. He pointed to important public institutions in Puerto Rico and their historical and cultural roots in Spanish rule. A few days before his arrival, some Puerto Ricans took it upon themselves to push over a statue of Ponce de Leon, one of the explorers who represented this purportedly benign Spanish rule. I wonder if when we think about Luke alongside Puerto Rico, we are faced with stories rooted in crisis, even a theological crisis. What if too many churches have cast a biblical and ethical imagination that has shriveled our capacities to love neighbors near and far? Even more, what if our teaching at theological schools has formed preachers and leaders who have fed a colonial imagination more concerned with ownership than with grace, power more than partnership, acquisition more than curiosity? Colonial imagination has taught us that the peoples of the world are means and not ends. That people and their lands are only as valuable as the goods they can produce for the colonial center. Colonial imagination has taught us that it is better to be right than loving. Colonial imagination has taught us that biblical interpretation is an act of grasping, of ownership, of claiming readings of Scripture as singular and as right and as universal, because they are mine and mine alone. In our thinking, and yes, our policies about immigration and migration, refugees, race, and ethnicity, we have been fed with a colonial imagination. An imagination that assumes ownership of the world, its resources, its people. Colonial imagination even imagines ownership over Scripture and its interpretation. It assumes there is a mainstream way to read these complex biblical texts, and then variations on it that we label Latinx or feminist or womanist. Colonial imagination assumes there is theology and variations from theology that require adjectives like black, liberation, queer, but all too rarely white or male or Western. Colonial imagination dominates lands, peoples, conversations. Colonial imagination draws on fear to lead us to imagine that there is not enough to go around, that welcoming them means rejecting us. Colonial imagination sees life as a zero-sum game where some will always be winners and others losers. In short, we have inherited and then consumed a marred theological imagination. That theological imagination is now consuming the migrant at the border, the immigrant who is our neighbor, the refugee fleeing from danger, the queer communities rejected and excluded, communities of color policed to their very deaths. A warped theological imagination has fed us a lie. That we own the table to which we invite others, that we are perpetual hosts, and others are perpetual guests. That hospitality is something we give, rarely something we receive. We imagine ourselves as those who might house someone fleeing danger, but all too rarely do we imagine ourselves as the refugee. And such an imagination, my friends, was not birthed at the tip of a spear, at the head of an army, or on the bow of a ship heading to a new land. No, that imagination wormed its way into our lives through preaching and prayer, the reading of Scripture, and the parceling out of grace. I began this evening by sharing that I wanted to share a story, but it's a story among many others. Now, while I would love everyone here to go visit Puerto Rico, that is not the primary aim of this lecture. Instead, my hope is to inspire in us all a desire to revisit the complexities and power of our stories, the stories of struggle and failure and persistence that made our living today possible. These stories, I think, are ingredient to biblical interpretation, indispensable to exegesis, needed especially now when a single story of loss and resentment and grievance is threatening to swallow us all. Thank you, friends.
So thank you. Last night, you challenged us to think of Luke through the lens of the horror of the cross. And tonight, you've invited us to think about Luke through Puerto Rico. And I have to say, it's just refreshing to hear someone whose understanding of the text is existentially bound up with their own life, so that there's not a yawning gap, but there is a direct engagement with the text. I think all of us deeply appreciate that. You undoubtedly have some questions, so let's open the floor to your questions tonight.
So many smart people in this room. This is going to be great.
Yeah, yeah. So, and Brock has a microphone. So who would like to ask the first question? You can start if you'd like, Michael. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, that was wonderful, not surprisingly. So I was actually just recently listening to a podcast with a woman who was an academic in Puerto Rico and who left the university in the financial crisis when all of that sort of happened that you were referencing. She now owns a farm, and she was talking in her podcast about how often academics assume that the academy is stable and sort of imagine that now what we're going through, these waves of instability, are creating a chaos that maybe lead us to wonder if we should leave. Exactly. That we've been insulated from. But in fact, she was saying from her position now, working on a farm, she's looking back at her life in academia and seeing the instabilities that were actually always there. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how that might connect with New Testament interpretation and kind of what you've been doing here, because to me the connections are are there. I just would love to hear you sort of think about that.
Oh, I want the link to that podcast so I can listen to it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I wonder if, there are, and when I think about some of our colleagues who lived in academic spaces that have felt vulnerable for longer, right? That places that have closed, like they've felt that, and I do think that some of us in some of these institutions have felt insulated, buffered from that, and now no longer can feel that. Part of it is, and I talked about this yesterday, is I think looking back through history, even thinking about these texts, that this idea of a crisis is kind of this revolving crisis that we keep finding ourselves in. And every once in a while we find ourselves caught up in a moment where it feels like the crisis has been alleviated. But maybe we talk about this a little bit tomorrow night too, that part of what Luke's eschatology is doing is reminding us of the presence of that crisis always kind of under the surface, while at the same time, the reality of resurrection and grace is also present there. I wonder if this, this sense of comfort, sense of being buffered is one that we need to always be interrogating, because we learn over and over again, it's never quite for long. Many more things that we should talk about, but that's at least a place to start. I'm so sorry. I went off all the time, yeah. Sorry about that.
Other questions? So I'm going to ask you one. When I think about the author of Luke, I actually don't think of somebody who's as much, and this is somebody who's at least reasonably educated, can write decent Greek,
Yes. Yeah.
actually knows some literature, and certainly knows the Septuagint exceptionally well.
Yes.
And you can debate, people debate, is the view of wealth that you renounce everything, or is it rather alms, that is, that you give? So in your reading through the eyes of Puerto Rico, how do you see the author of this text, and where does he fit?
It's a great question.
At the social level?
Yeah. A great question. And I think when I think about students taking first year Greek, and I'm teaching Greek exegesis of Acts, and they're like, oh, I'm ready to go. I was like, are you sure? Because Luke's Greek is a little more challenging than that. I think there are great questions to ask about Luke's own positionality, and questions about to what extent even his narration of this story, even if he finds himself not in a colonized space, he's recounting events that are very much set in there, and maybe even without knowing what he's doing, he's narrating this colonized space. But I do wonder if there's, I hadn't thought about this, but is there a possibility too that even folks, and this is true today, like even folks who find themselves being able to take advantage of education and some resources, that the question isn't whether you're on the side of the colonized or the colonizer, but that a lot of us find ourselves caught between those two polarities. And I want to think more about this, but maybe there's a way in which Luke finds himself caught between those realities, so has all these linguistic capacities, all the resources that he thanks Theophilus for to be able to compose a text like this. And it's significant and weighty, especially moving into Acts. But maybe he still has a foot in both of those worlds. I want to think more. I think that's a really fascinating inquiry. Do you have thoughts about that?
I think
think?
what you're saying is right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure that the author is a Roman citizen, but the author doesn't know the geography of Palestine very well at all, and so, but knows the geography of the Mediterranean,
Better.
at least the Aegean area, exceptionally well.
Yeah.
I mean, very accurate there.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I don't know that the author is a Roman coming from that. It's not the upper crust. And there's a big gap between, say, the way that this author writes and Philo of Alexandria can write, and certainly the way Plutarch writes. But on the other hand, this is not the papyri.
Yeah. It's not everyday language either.
No. So it's far more elevated.
Yeah.
And
The other thought is as you know, like there's recent folks kind of bringing back the arguments about Luke being a Jewish writer in the diaspora. And I think that might be an interesting wrinkle of it. So if he is a Jewish writer with these elite capacities as well, and now he's yearning for a home that maybe he's never seen, he hasn't journeyed there, he's just relying on whatever information he has, that maybe that forlornness is also present there, even as he has all these capacities and abilities. I want to think more about that, but I think there might be something there as well.
And I think the author has to be at least somebody who goes to the shul, the synagogue. On a regular
Just knowing the Septuagint so well, yeah,
as
yeah.
the author would say,
Yeah.
or Jewish.
Yeah.
One of those two.
Yeah. Fascinating.
All right, well, we
Love
can
it.
go on. The homiletics are being quiet. This is great.
We're going to keep nerding out over here on authorship, unless you all say it. No.
So I want to say this for the students here. Justo Gonzalez, whom Professor Barreto showed, is an alum of this school.
Yeah.
You may not know that, but he is an alum of this school. And you probably don't know this, but Virgilio Elizondo was a good friend of mine. Oh, I didn't know that. So blessed memory now.
Love it.
I know Virgilio quite well.
I love that. Wow.
About the world of it. All right. Would you join me, remember tomorrow night, on the future?
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about the lecture tomorrow night?
Luke in the days to come, and we'll do some reading alongside some recent novels that I've found really interesting in thinking about our future. So we'll be in conversation with even some sci-fi. So we'll have some fun tomorrow. Yeah,
So
thank you for
come
that.
tomorrow night, bring some of your friends, but,
I have kind of a Ricky question.
Okay,
Because we
yeah.
have politicians in the room, and because you're here, so forgive me, but so it's dawning on me that in a narrative kind of way, there's the story that Luke is telling about Jesus, and then there are Jesus' words, and the slippage between that.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you guys preach, like, do you address that? Do you address that slippage when you preach and when you engage these texts? Like, when you, not just in a study forum, but do you make that explicit when you're preaching the Word of God? You know, like, where do you?
Great.
Camera's still on, isn't it? I just want to say this. Depending on one's context, so my context normatively is the Episcopal Church where I preach and preside. I find that spurring a love of the content and theology of Scripture is really important. I don't know that layering in. I do stuff with irony and paradox generally, but the teaching that would be required from the pulpit, I think, to talk about what you're talking about might not make for the most fruitful homiletical message for an audience that may never have read the biblical book at all, that biblical book, and may have heard some preaching, RCL, Revised Common Lectionary Text, and maybe not much more than that. So it's a question of deeply respecting where your audience might be and trying to be as effective as possible. So short answer would be no, and that would be the longer answer. And Professor McCrae, do you have a thought?
I guess my short answer is it depends. It depends so much on the broader aim of the sermon and what I might be trying to do. And so often I tend to lean into the moment that we're living in and the emotional tone of that moment and the spiritual demands of that moment. And sometimes I feel like I have license to go into different places in the text within the time allotted, and sometimes there are beautiful things that are on the cutting room floor that I lose in the aim of just trying to speak to where people are. So it just depends a lot for me.
I'll say one thing, and then Michael Beth, I think Dr. Engler was, I think when it comes to our preaching, I get to drop in and preach one Sunday and then jet so I can throw a bomb. And often, the pastors often appreciate this. I asked them before. I don't just do it without them. But one of them, for example, had an 8 o'clock service, and I was going to borrow their robe, and he's like, wait, it's a very small service. If you don't wear a robe, then maybe I don't have to wear a robe in the future. So there's a difference between the one-off preacher and someone who's with a community for a whole season. And I think The other part of it depends, I wonder if I can, the way I think about it and tell my students is that you can sprinkle in some of these ideas as you go along, that you're forming a community over a whole season. So it's not one sermon that might do this, but creating the possibilities of imagination and kind of playfulness with the text is something that I think we can do over a long season of work. Yeah.
And one last response. You drew a lot of responses.
This is
It
great.
was not a rookie question. It was an
Yeah,
excellent question.
totally.
As a New Testament scholar, and particularly a Lucan scholar, I always say when I'm preaching, Luke tells us Jesus says, or Luke's Jesus says.
Yeah.
So I do qualify it. I don't say why necessarily, but it's very subtle. But if you were sitting there listening, you would know that's what I'm doing. And then later in other contexts, maybe explain why I do that,
Yep.
if that's helpful.
You're right.
I have never preached a sermon on the historical Jesus. All right. Would you join me in thanking
Thank you.
Professor Barreto
Thank
one
you, friends.
last time?
Okay, thank you.